Good morning. Please take your Bibles and open to Acts chapter 12. We'll pretty much be setting up camp in this chapter today and working through this very interesting story. So glad to see everyone today. We do have visitors, encouraged by your presence. Hope you'll come back anytime. We're working through the book of Acts this year, and Acts is a book that has a lot of back and forth that goes from positive stories to negative stories, sometimes within the same story. It alternates between external and internal issues. In fact, that's a good way to go through the book of Acts, maybe as a review is, all right, internal issue, internal issue, all right, positive, negative. And what we see in Acts 12 is that there's an external issue that begins negative but ends positively. And so I had two people tell me this morning they were excited about my lesson today, that they like Acts 12. And my first thought was, oh no, I hope I don't mess it up. I'd almost kind of rather them preach it now. I don't want to say something that doesn't give credit where credit is due here. But I do like this chapter. I think it's a very interesting story, one that we can learn a few lessons from. It begins in verse 1, about that time Herod. So let's first review which Herod this is. This is the nephew of the Herod that Jesus was sent to. Jesus was sent from Pilate to Herod. Pilate was trying to get Jesus off his hands, sent him to the uncle of this Herod. This is the father of the Herod that questions Paul later in Acts. And so it is just simply referred to as Herod. And what's interesting in the Gospels and Acts, really the Herods are all kind of lumped together. They're all the same character. There's someone who doesn't do what they should be doing. The difference maybe with this one is that this one had a good relationship with the Jews. They liked him, and he appealed to their sensibilities sometimes. I'm going to go ahead and ruin the story for you. Let's talk about who's in control. In this chapter, it's Herod who has James killed. It's Herod who has Peter thrown in prison. It's Herod who is angry with the people. But it's God who's in control. And it's always God who's in control. And so if you get nothing else outside of the lesson today, take that with you. That God is always, even when it appears that Herod is in control, it's God. This is his world. This is his story. And I thank Nathan for the songs that he is leading for us today. They go well with our lesson. All right, let's get in, starting with this idea in the first three verses. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread, and when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. This first bit of the story, we see that God allows James to be executed. Well, which James is this? This is James, the brother of John, son of Zebedee, one of the very first disciples. One of the first 4 that are called here. You'll remember in Mark 3 at verse 17, Jesus had given him and his brother the nickname, Son of Thunder. These are 2 of the guys who had gone to Jesus and said, actually they had their mommy go to Jesus and say, can we sit at your right hand and your left hand? This is one of Jesus' closest friends. When he goes into the garden, when he goes to the Mount of Transfiguration, when he goes to heal Jairus' daughter, he brings Peter, James, and John in. They were his closest confidants. And I read this story, and I can't help but be moved by the fact that here is the first apostle that's martyred. Judas is dead. He did that to himself. And here we have the first apostle that's killed. Jesus had asked if they were ready for this. When they sent their mommy to him, he says, I have a baptism to be baptized with. Can you handle it? Can you live up to that? And they say, yes, we can. And James does. And I have to ask, just because I'm curious of mine, why does God allow this? Here is someone who has been there from the beginning, and in just a moment, Peter is going to be divinely freed from prison. Why is James allowed to be killed? You know, sometimes we go through Scripture and we can make some sense in the story of why the individual died. So I go back, I mentioned in Bible class, we're doing the United Kingdom with the high school and the junior high class. And when you look at Jonathan, son of Saul, David's buddy, he dies in the same battle that Saul dies. And you hate that because he and David are buddies, and he had actually told David, I know you'll be king and I'll be your right-hand man. But then he dies. I think I have a pretty good grasp on why God allows that to happen. First, he goes out with his boots on and a sword in his hand, which is how most soldiers would prefer to go out if they're going to. But also, what happens if David dies, or Saul dies, David is made king, and Jonathan is still alive? There's going to be some issues there. And in God's wisdom, God allows him to go out in the midst of battle. What about John the Baptist? We read that story and we're heartbroken as John winds up in prison, and maybe even John himself is worried and wondering, did I follow the right guy? He even sends messengers to Jesus. Are you the one who is to come? Shall we look for another? Jesus kind of reassures him, no, you got the right guy. Why does John die? Well, he had even said, I must decrease, that he may increase. And so sometimes in our lives, some people die, and we think they had a good long life. They had a good long life. They had done a lot of good, and they were tired. They were ready to go on home. And we can think about that, and while it's still sad, we can make sense of that in our minds, right? But then there's sometimes we don't have a clue. I can't help but think about King Josiah. King Josiah was such a good king. He is compared to David regularly. And he is said to be one of the better kings in Judah. And he dies at seemingly a very young age, when there's more that he could have done, when there was more left to do. And then we get here to James, a courageous eyewitness of Jesus who seemingly had work to do. The gospel's just getting going. We've just now crossed the Gentile barrier. Surely we need James in the fold to get some work done, and we can't make sense of it. And then we hear the stories in our lives about a young mother or a young father with little kids at home. And we think, why does God allow this? My freshman year at Florida College, Dr. Phil Roberts, who was an amazing teacher and had an impact on thousands of young people, at the age of 58, developed pancreatic cancer, and within a year had passed. And you kind of think, he has so much influence on so many people, and he's doing so much good. Why does God allow that to happen? I don't know. I could maybe come up with some things that might give us some comfort, But the simple fact is, I don't know. But I trust God because He's in control. I don't know what all of God's plan is. I don't know what all of God's will is. I don't know what God sees down the road. I don't know what God is orchestrating in the lives of His people. But I know He's on the throne. And I'm not called to understand and explain everything that's happened. I'm called to have faith. And if I know that God is in control, that God is on His throne, then I can let Him have it. Because I surely don't want Him offering me what He offered to Job. Hey, you think you can do a better job here? Because my quick answer would be, no, sir. I'd respond just like Job. I lay my hand over my mouth. I'm sorry. I spoke once. I will not speak again. We have to learn that God is on His throne and to trust Him. That's why the book of Revelation begins the way it does. All this chaos is happening. All this stuff is going on, and you're like, God, why are you letting this happen? So you know how the book starts? The book starts with a vision of God on His throne. He is in control. He's the king. He is the shaper of destiny. So whatever else happens, God's got it. And we need to trust in Him and not worry, but allow Him to do what He plans to do. God allows James to be executed, but then in verses 3 through 17, He frees Peter from prison. Why James and not Peter? Why Peter and not James? Why? I don't know, but this is the way the story is told. This part of the story is actually pretty funny. And if you just kind of allow yourself to be immersed in it, it's pretty funny. So he goes, he has James executed, and everybody responds so positively to that. He says, all right, well, I'll up the ante, and I'll go get Peter. And so he goes and gets Peter, and did you hear what I read? That he delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers. Peter's gotten out of prison before. It's not going to happen again. Or at least that's what Herod thinks. So Peter is in prison. He's asleep. And the angel of the Lord comes in. And the only picture I get here is he kind of kicks him in the side. Hey, what are you doing? We got to go. And so Peter, almost sleepwalking, follows the angel out, and the door opens automatically for him. And he walks through the door, and they finally get out to the street, and Peter kind of wakes up and is like, oh, this isn't a dream. And so he knows that the brethren have been praying for him. So he goes to the house of John Mark, his mom, and he knocks on the door, and the servant girl comes to the gate and hears that it's Peter, and she's so excited, she doesn't even let him in. She runs back in to tell everybody, Peter's here, and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. And it's easier for Peter to get out of prison than it is for him to get into the home where the saints are. And you see, that's what happens when God is working. And so they finally go and get Peter and let him in, and he lets him know everything that's going on. It's actually a very humorous story. 4 squadrons of guards. He's not going anywhere until he does, because God is in control. God has control of all these guards that He has put around Peter, that He's trying to keep him there, and that is no halting action for God. We see the activity of the guards. We see the activity of the brethren in verses 5 and verse 12. You notice that they have gathered and they're praying for him. There are some times that we don't know what's happening, and we assume the worst is going to happen. And so Peter is, it seems, at his end. And who's going to stop Herod? He's in control. You can't stop him. And so the brethren, they all get together and they're praying. What do you think that prayer sounded like? What do you think they prayed for? Peter, no doubt, but maybe also James's family, who's still reeling from the loss of their brother and son. No doubt John is there with them, probably praying for the whole Jerusalem church, that if they're coming after the leaders, it's not long before the others are going to be hunted down. We already saw in Acts chapter 4 that they were praying for courage, that yes, people are out to get us, but help us to have the courage to keep preaching the gospel. No doubt they're praying for change, that Herod wouldn't continue to be a persecutor of the church. I wonder if they ended that prayer, not our will, but yours be done. Even if it means death. So we see the activity of the church, and then we see Peter's behavior. Do you remember what we said? Could you sleep knowing tomorrow morning you were going to be drug out and executed? Can I tell you a funny thing? When I was a child, my greatest fear, and this is dumb, it makes no sense. My greatest fear was ending up on death row. I don't know why. Other than the fact that my parents liked to watch America's Most Wanted. It's the only connection I could make. I was terrified of ending up on death row. Part of it is, do y'all remember that show Quantum Leap with Scott Bakula? All right, I only remember one. I remember the theme of the show and what happened in the show. There's only one episode I remember, and I only remember the last minute. At the very last second of the show, he leaps into somebody that's sitting in the electric chair about to be executed. If you know the ending to that story, please tell me afterwards. I really need to figure it out. It's bothered me for years. I was terrified that I'd end up on death row some way or another because of my apparently violent tendencies. But I mean, can you imagine, so you see the movies and the shows and they ask them what they want for their last meal. How do you eat at a time like that? How do you sleep? I guess coming from Alabama, they always did it at midnight. So I don't guess you really had to sleep that night. And yet you look here at Peter and he's asleep. Where does that kind of peace come from? It comes from knowing that God's in control. It comes from knowing that God is on his throne. There's literally nothing Peter can do at this moment. The others might be able to. The others are praying. They could move. They can hide. I guess it wouldn't be right, but I guess they could fight back. There's nothing Peter can do at this moment. So why worry about something that's out of your control? Especially when God is in control. Just a question to think about. If we were in Bible class, I'd ask for an answer. Where do you think Peter learned this? You remember that night that they were on the boat and the storm arose? And the disciples are trying their best to get to shore. And they're scared for their lives. Experienced fishermen are scared for their lives. And Jesus is asleep. Why? Jesus knows who's in control. Jesus knows his Father is in control. And so he can sleep. Peter knows that God is in control. He understands. That night they asked him, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" Peter understands. Jesus knows exactly. Jesus cares for them. Peter likely assumes that he will be executed. And I can sleep because God's in control. The church likely assumes that Peter will be executed. But they still pray because they know God's in control. And then we get this story and find out that Herod is not nearly in control like he thinks he is. Let's read this section in verse 20. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, And they came to him with one accord, and having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace because their country depended on the king's country for food. So he has been giving this region food. Something has happened, and now he's mad at them. They're afraid they're not going to get food anymore. So they've beseeched Blastus, his servant, to give them an audience here. Verse 21. On the appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes. He took his seat upon the throne and delivered an oration to them. And the people were shouting, "The voice of a God and not of a man." Immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. Here's another situation where it seems like Herod is in control. He has the people of Tyre and Sidon literally eating out of his hand. And he controls whether they get food or not. They have to beseech him. They have to beg him. And here he is standing as a king before them. And as they're going to kind of suck up to him a little bit here, he's going to play the part of a god. It's really interesting, folks. Even Josephus tells us this story. He gives us a little bit more detail about it. There came together for this occasion a large number of provincial officials and others of distinguished position. On the second day of the shows, Agrippa put on his robe made of silver throughout, of quite wonderful weaving, and entered the theater at break of day. Then the silver shone and glittered wonderfully as the sun's first rays fell on it, and its resplendence inspired a sort of fear and trembling in those who gazed at it. Immediately his flatterers called out from various directions in language which boded him no good, for they invoked him as a god. "Be gracious to us," they cried. "Hitherto we have reverenced you as a human being, but henceforth we confess you to be more than mortal nature." He did not rebuke them, nor did he repudiate their impious flattery. But soon afterward he looked up and saw an owl sitting on a rope above his head, and recognized it at once as a messenger of evil, as on a former occasion it had been a messenger of good. And a pang of grief pierced his heart. At the same time he was seized with a severe pain in his bowels, which quickly increased in intensity. He was hastily carried into the palace, and when he had suffered continuously for 5 days from pain in his belly, he died in the 54th year of his life, in the 7th year of his kingship. I think there's a contrast with Peter here. Herod, who thinks he's in control, stands up and accepts the praise of these people. Do you remember what Peter had done when Cornelius bowed down and tried to worship him? He said, "No, brother, stand up. I'm just a man." So you have the humility of one of these men and the arrogance of the other, I think, is an important point here. And then we see in verse 23, Herod, who had the title, Herod, who had the land, who had the people, who looks the part, who sounds the part, but God's in control. And God will not have some puny human claim what rightfully belongs to God alone. I'm going to talk about a kind of movie that I would almost never talk about in a sermon. I can't even remember which of the Avenger movies it was. And so if you don't know anything about them, that's fine. If you've seen this scene, you'll appreciate it. There is a scene in which the Incredible Hulk, we all know him, takes Loki, the god of mischief, and smashes him into the ground 58 times and walks away saying, "Puny human." Or puny god, I think. Yeah, puny god. And I know that's kind of a cultural movie reference. I get it. But that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with the God who's actually in control versus a human who thinks he's God, who thinks he's in control. And what we see is that God is still on the throne. For much of the chapter, it looks like Herod is in control. It looks like Herod's the boss. The people assume that Herod is the boss. But I want you to notice verse 24. But the word of God increased and multiplied. God is in control. Even when Herod is killing people, even when the saints are being murdered, even when the apostles are being wiped out and imprisoned, God's good news is still sounding forth. And there's only one reason that can happen, and that's because God is in control. And I know that life is unpredictable. I know that life can be chaotic. Things don't end up going the way we had hoped they would. We showed the kids the other night the movie with Bruce Willis. It's called The Kid. It's a sweet little movie. And he meets his younger self, his 8-year-old self, and his 8-year-old self is devastated because he doesn't have a girl, he doesn't fly jets, and he doesn't have a dog. What a loser. Rarely do things go the way we planned for them to. And then we get to serious matters when one person lives and another dies. And it may appear that the government, your boss, Mother Nature, I'm looking at my notes, I almost said mother-in-law. What? It may appear that even Satan is in control. Those two last things are not related. It may appear that everything else is controlled by somebody else. It may appear that way. But God is in control, and He promises victory. We may not know how it's going to play out. That is why we are called to have faith. I want to share with you one more story of a man who I don't understand what happened to him, why it happened. His name was David Hartzell. He was a preacher in Alabama for many years. And he was a very powerful preacher and had done a lot of good. He had been in a couple of congregations that were in college towns. And where he was last was where the University of Alabama was, in Tuscaloosa. And a lot of college students were there, and he was having such a great impact on them. And he began to have some issues, and come to find out he had a brain tumor. And they were able to get rid of this tumor, and he was able to carry on the work that he was doing. He had kind of like silent seizures almost. They weren't the normal thing you think of. Basically, he would just kind of zone out for a second, and then he'd come back in. A few years later, the tumors came back, and this time when they were doing the operation, what they warned could happen in an operation like that happened. And it did damage. And he was no longer able to preach and teach, could barely communicate, and eventually passed away at a fairly young age. And I struggle with that. And that situation, he was doing so much good. And I remember something that he used to talk about. A lot of fans of football wouldn't appreciate this. They'd say it's the wrong way to watch a game. But this is how he watched Alabama games. He would record them and watch them after he knew who won. Now, most people would say that takes the fun out of it. Now, in those days, if you were an Alabama fan, you usually didn't have to worry about it. They won. But he said it's very interesting watching a game when you know the outcome of the game. And when you know Alabama wins by a field goal, it doesn't sting nearly as much when the running back fumbles at the 1-yard line with 2 minutes left. at a moment when you would normally be throwing things at the television and screaming, "I thought you were on scholarship!" Yelling and losing your mind because the worst possible thing has happened, David Hartzell could sit there with a smirk on his face, knowing that somehow or another, Alabama got back down the field and kicked a field goal and won the game. And he would rightfully make the application to God on the throne. There's a lot of things in life that drive us crazy. We don't know how to respond. We don't know what to say. We don't know how to even take in this information. It feels overwhelming. We want to throw things at the TV and scream. When I know it still hurts, but we can sit there with a smile on our face because, guys, we know who wins the game. We know that God is in control. He's on his throne. And that if we're on the right team, victory is ours. So, won't you let him have control? Won't you surrender all to him? And once you do that, you live a life of telling other people about the king who sits on the throne and is in control. Did you notice that last passage we read? And the word of God continued to sound forth. Because even in the midst of chaos and trouble, God is on his throne, and our strength or our faith can be strengthened and our numbers increased. You know why? Because God is in charge. And if you haven't submitted to him, now is the time to do that. To give him your all, to give him everything, your faith and your obedience, to be buried with him in the waters of baptism and rise to walk a new life free of sin, a focus on him, and service to the one who controls everything. Give yourself to him this morning while we stand and while we sing.